Welcome back to another episode of Paint Society, the channel where learning doesn't stop when the video ends. Now in this video, it's a great episode if you're new to sanding body filler or even applying it. I'm going to take you through the two different types of body fillers that we have, and that is the regular body filler and of course an icing, which is a much thinner body filler. Then today we're going to show you how to sand it, and we're testing out Eastwood's new DSB sanding system. It is basically a sanding system that you can hook right up to any vacuum, and well, if you're in your home garage and you're concerned about dust, well, this might be the budget-friendly solution, so you can keep all of those particulates stored away in the vacuum cleaner. So let's go ahead and get started. And the first thing I'm going to be using is a pre-painting prep, and basically what that's going to do for me is just clean out any of the contaminants that might be in the surface, and this is the area that I want to fill first. Now this has already been sanded with a P180 grit, so that is okay for filler to go over primer when you're sanding with that type of grit. Now the first type of filler I'm going to be using is a polyester glazing putty. Now there's so many different types of fillers that you can use, but if you're looking for something just thin, you want to get glazing putty. It doesn't matter what the brand is, they're all going to be very similar. And what I have here, this is a smart sheet, or they even have them in clean sheets, and basically there's a whole bunch of different layers here. You can just tear it off, and you don't want any old body filler in your body filler when it comes to mixing it up. So this is a good investment to have. They're pretty cheap, and you don't have to go looking around for something. Also, you don't want to mix body filler on a box because a box is porous, and that can introduce, well, air pockets and pinholes. Now you never want to over harden your product, and you never want to under harden. So what I like to do is I make a circle, okay? And basically all I do is I take my hardener and I don't go completely across, but I just make a line halfway, and that's enough right there. And that will be enough to kick it and give us enough working time to make sure we're good to go. Now when we go to mix up our filler, we never want to stir it. We always want to completely overlap it. By overlapping it, what we're doing is we're mixing it properly and not introducing air bubbles into the mix. If we were to stir it, that could possibly introduce air bubbles. So we're basically going to take it and get it all up on our spreader and then spread it out on our sheet here, and we can see the streaks. We don't want those streaks at all. And another thing I like to do is make sure that all of the filler is off of the spreader. So in this case, I like to really get it off completely, because you don't want any extra filler that's still on the spreader that is not mixed or not hardened, because sometimes that can make its way all the way up onto your panel, and that will not harden. And once you put your primer over it, it's too late. You're going to have to dig it back out. So make sure you take the time to properly mix the product before you apply it. Don't ever be in a rush in anything that you do when it comes to auto body and painting, because you're just going to have to take the time to redo it. Now this process of mixing should take no longer than about 30 seconds. You don't want to be here all day mixing, or else you'll find out real quick it's going to harden up. Now all I'm going to do right here is just I'm going to fill a small area that was a little bit low, and there were some little bit of rock chips here and there, and I like to press it down. I like to get all my filler basically on the panel first before I start to shape it or whatnot. So I'm just doing the front end here where I noticed that there was some little rock chips and a little bit of a low spot, and I'm just taking it and now I'm smoothing it out. Now there might be a little bit of a ridge here and there, and that's okay. Towards the end, once you're just about done, what you can do is you can lighten up the load a little bit, and that will help remove those ridges just a little bit. Not a deal breaker, but always nice to have no ridges in your body filler. So you can see right here, we have a nice area that's good to go. Now your next question might be, well, how long is it going to take to set up? Oh, that's a great question. You don't want to start getting on your body filler too soon, because you can prematurely sand it, and what sometimes that does is it leaves coarse sanding marks in your body filler that you can't recover from, that you would need to refill. So let's give this a good 15 minutes and let's make sure it's completely hard. That's going to give us a much nicer sand. So we'll use that time while it's drying to set up our Eastwood DSB and take a closer look. Well, this is my personal shop vac, and the whole point of this system is to use a regular shop vac, with the Contours DSB, and to keep your garage, your workspace a lot cleaner. Now what this system comes with is a 16-inch block and the 5-inch block, which we'll probably be using on the hood. Now what makes this system unique is it has its own sandpaper and its own holes that really match up to the actual block itself. So let's go ahead and get a closer look and take this thing apart and get it all set up. And this is our 5-inch block, and you can see here that it has the vacuum stem on the top. So I'm interested to see, will that be in the way or will it be just okay? Now this is a very lightweight block, something I've never really countered before, so very interested to see how well it works. It's a 5-inch block, but it is about 1.5 inches tall, a nice sturdy grip, and it should be pretty good for our sanding. Let's go ahead and get some sandpaper on here and see how well it matches up with these holes. Now when it comes to sanding, they offer 40 all the way up to 400, but really guys, you're never going to be blocking with a 400 grit. I would say 320 might be your cutoff. Now what do you actually sand that initial body filler with? Well, I like to just knock it down with 80. That's what I prefer to do, and I like to take the tops off and just kind of smooth it out a little bit. So we're going to start with 80 grit first and see how well that works. This particular paper is the sticky paper. There's two different types of sandpapers on the market, and they'll be the stick or the hook and loop or Velcro or whatever you might call it. But this is the sticky paper, and sometimes you run into issues with the sticky paper because guys, the dust just collects on it and it makes it very tough to reapply new paper. You end up having to blow it off all the time. But using the vacuum system, you might have a big difference here, and that's what I'm really interested to see. You can see the sandpaper has all the holes to match up with the actual block itself. And we take a look at the backside. It's got that backside sheeting adhesive. You just pull right off. Now when it comes to matching them up, they don't match up identical, but if you just put them in a similar spot, you should still get that same vacuum. Now upon opening up the box, you'll find the 11-inch sander. Now the cool thing about this whole kit is you can decide which blocks will work for you, because there's different options obviously for the different sanding, whether your project's much bigger or maybe just a little bit smaller. Now in the actual kit here, we'll have the 11-inch block, and then we have a vacuum adapter. Now this is the first time I'm putting this together, so I'm curious to see how well everything fits together for the first time. And of course, we have our vacuum hose right here. So let's go ahead over to my shop vac and let's get it set up. Now, what made the most sense to me when coming to hook this up is we're gonna use the original hose that came with the unit because it fits it. And then we're gonna go to the opposite side. Now, when it comes to hooking it up, there's a few ways you can do it. Now, I was lucky enough to have this part right here because all vacuums will be just a little bit different. So this is like an adapter, a step down adapter, and basically all I did with it is I put it on the opposite end of the hose right here. And then I took the Eastwood hose and, well, you can just do a pressure fit right in here and it's good to go. So it might look a little funny, but as long as there's suction, and that there's suction at the other end right here. And in this area right before the Eastwood hose, there's a little valve that you can control the air. And now we're ready to connect the Eastwood hose to the actual block itself. And that's a nice tight fit right there. So you're good to go. Now, one thing I did notice about the sandpaper that I didn't do on the 5-inch block is that they do recommend that you overlap the edge just probably by a ½ inch or so. And what that does is it helps eliminate any of the dust moving through the sanding block and lifting the edge of the sandpaper. So since this is a sticky paper, you should be able to just stick it just like that and then come over to the other edge. We'll go ahead and snip about a ½ inch off here and we're good to go. Now it's been about a good 15 minutes and we're ready to just go ahead and sand this down with our 80 grit first. Now the whole point of this dustless system is to really have virtually no dust. Now there will be a little bit of Bondo dust that will be on the ground, I'm sure, but instead of having dust all over the garage, well, I want to keep it nice and clean. That really helps out the job overall. So we're gonna go ahead and give it to the test and see, well, does it really work, or should you just go sand outside? I'll go ahead and turn her on. And we'll start to sand it. Now I really want to test it out because this is 80 grit, and right now I don't see anything on the ground. And usually in 80 grit you would see some sort of contamination or dust or whatever you're sanding on the ground. So I'm going to turn off the vacuum. You can hear it's off. Let's see if there's actual dust being made from this. Wow. So basically what we have here, you can see all the dust, right? All that dust. It hasn't made its way down to the ground yet, but it's ready to. It's all sitting right there. It's pretty much not getting sucked. So let's just keep that same dust there. Let's turn the vacuum. This is all in one clip. Let's turn the vacuum on and let's continue to sand and see if any of that dust gets picked up. All right, let's turn it off. I'm really impressed, to be honest with you guys. Look at, there's no dust. Let's take a look at the vacuum and we'll see, what do we have? Oh, we got the dust piling up in here. It's not a whole lot. A lot of it's on the filter. We haven't done a lot of sanding, but the good news is, guys, it's looking pretty good so far. So let's talk a little bit about some Bondo tips, all right? So we've talked about the dust extractor. It seems to be working right now, but let's talk a little bit more about how to sand, okay? So when you're sanding with an 80 grit, basically what you're doing is you're shaping. Now the reason I don't use a 180 initially with any type of body filler is because you basically are just going over the mountain instead of cutting the mountain flat, right? So whenever you lay down body filler, you're gonna have some, waves that might be a little bit taller than what they need to be. But if you try to sand it with 180, you're just gonna smooth out those waves. We wanna cut them flat, and that's exactly what we've done with the 80 grit. So now I like to, once I get it kind of shaped out, I'm gonna switch out to the 180 grit, and we're not gonna use this block anymore. This block would still work, but I noticed that might be a little bit too big for what we're doing here, so we're gonna step it down to the 5-inch block, and we're gonna use a 180 on the 5-inch block, and we're gonna see how well we can smooth it out. And I'm gonna show you guys, when do you stop? Sometimes we don't know when to stop or how much to keep on going, and we're gonna determine that right now. Now we can see in this area that we got some Bondo marks from the spreader from when we initially spread it out, and we're gonna have to sand these completely flat. But the basis of the body filler is nice and smooth, right? Now the areas that you're gonna run into that will give you some sort of issues will be all the way over in these areas, because that's where the feather edge is, okay? The feather edge is so important because it needs to transition into the rest of the paint seamlessly, and if it doesn't, once you go to prime it, you're going to see something, and if you don't sand it down, you're going to notice in paint that you had some big marks of Bondo or big work area. So you want to make sure that the base of the area you're working is good, as well as the surrounding areas. So at times you're going to need to feather out or extend the block sanding at least, I would say, 3 to 4 inches past the area in which you're sanding. And we're going to start to sand a little bit further to really start to feather out that body filler where it needs to be. I like to sand in an X one way and then the other way. And then come back the other way. Virtually no dust. No dust at all. I'm going to pause it right there for a moment. Now we've gotten to the point that we no longer can see what we're doing necessarily, and we need a visual aid, because I can see here that there might be some areas of concern over at the ends and I need a visual aid to really help me out. Now, all I'm going to do is spray a little bit of guide coat on here, and this is a black paint, and what this does is it's going to really highlight the areas that still need a little bit more sanding and the areas that are sanded enough. And we'll use this to highlight exactly what we have going on. So let's kick on the vacuum. We're still going to use our X pattern. That's really going to help out. Now I'm going to sand this lightly and then show you exactly what we're talking about in regards to the guide coat really doing its job. Now overall this hood wasn't too bad, but a lot of us don't know, hey, do we stop right here? Do I have to apply more body filler? Do I sand more? And it's a little bit of both. You gotta know what to do really. So if you take a look in this area right over here, we can see there is like a little bit of a groove. And basically what the guide coat has done is it's highlighted that area. And it's pretty much shown us that, hey, I'm not really feathered out here. Come look at me. And when I go to look, I actually feel it, and it's the truth. This area right here, it's not smooth, as opposed to this. You guys look over in this area, there's no guide coat really, because basically it's all been sanded smooth with the body filler and the primer. So I come over here and I'm like, hey, yeah, this is smooth, this is nice. And then I come over to this side and I notice that, you know, the guide coat is kind of sinking in to these scratches right here from the 80 grit. And we never want to prime over 80 grit. I would say 320 max, but you can get away with 220 priming over it. But I will tell you, this is going to need a little bit more of a sanding in this area. Also, the guide coat is showing us that, you know, with the contours of the actual hood itself, this is a breakthrough, okay? And that's what the body is showing you as well, that this is a breakthrough. That doesn't mean that it's a high spot. That just means that the contour of the actual hood itself is a little bit higher. And, well, we don't need to completely sand all this off, but we need to continue to feather around our areas. So we'll continue to feather around with our areas with 180, and I think we're going to be good to go on this one. And after that pass of 180, you could see that we're completely feathered out in all the areas we need to. Now, I have a little bit of residual body filler over in this area, but I'm not too concerned about it because I can go ahead and get this with a higher grit. You don't want to be using the aggressive grit really outside of your body filler area, because then you're going to have to continue to prime a little bit further, and we want to contain this as much as possible if doing a smaller repair. Now the next step is to refine our sanding scratch. Now if I was at a shop, I would basically just take my DA sander with my big gigantic compressor and I would sand it smooth and I would be good to go. But a lot of you guys at home, you just don't have those capabilities, so it's no problem. We'll get the same outcome. All we gotta do is just change out the sandpaper and step it up instead. And basically what I'm gonna be doing, guys, is I'm gonna be using a 320 grit here. And the reason why I'm going to use a 320 grit is because when you sand by hand, it's more an aggressive scratch. So even though it's just 320, well, we can do damage if we're using a lower grit. So let's go ahead and use a higher grit, and we can be a little bit more, you know, tough on it, and we're not going to put more than a 320 grit in there. So we'll go ahead and cut off our piece, and we'll attach it to our sanding block. We'll overlap once again like we learned. Go ahead and overlap it here, cut off the excess. And now we have a 320 sanding scratch, and we'll use this to really get ready for primer. Now when you're doing your final sanding of your 320, you're going to want to take it a step further and go a little bit bigger than what you were doing with your 180, but no worries because it's a higher grit, so you're not going to be too concerned with doing too much damage because you're only putting a 320 grit scratch in it. So basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to take it about maybe 6 inches further. That way our primer has something to stick to, and we have a nice feather edge from our body filler into the original panel. Now with the higher grits, I got a little bit too much suction, so I'm going to open it up a little bit. So it's still sticking a little bit, so I'm going to open it up a little bit more. Now that is nice and smooth. Now, if it's any indication how clean the sanding is, well, take a look at my shirt. I wore a black shirt on purpose to show you guys that, you know, it actually is working pretty well. Usually in this type of situation, I'm covered in dust. Now, I will mention about the vacuum hose, it doesn't really get in the way too much. You kind of learn how to use it. Of course, if it totally wasn't there or if it was on the edge, that might make things a little bit easier, but considering the price and how much you're gonna save on buying this instead of having to buy a dust extractor whole system, I think it's a pretty fair trade-off. So at this point, our Corvette hood, this would be ready for primer. Now this video is primarily just about body filler and different types of body filler. So we're gonna go ahead and leave this for another time when we'll talk about primer and how to primer your parts and different types of primers. But for now, let's chat about a thicker body filler. Now that other type of body filler is gonna be your regular body filler. It's a little bit thicker. Now you remember the polyester putty, well that's a little bit thinner, okay? But this is gonna be for when you have real repairs. Let's say you're repairing a door, or let's say you're doing some repair on a trunk or something like that. You're gonna wanna use more of a premium, thicker body filler. Now the difference with something like this is it's gonna be a little bit harder to sand. The actual glazing putty that we used before on the actual hood, that's a much smoother, easier sanding filler. A filler like this is meant to fill and smooth and block out so that you have an area that maybe was a little bit wavy, but you know, after applying a filler just like this, you can really sand it smooth. Now, just remember, you're probably gonna have to use maybe an extra coat to lay it down, but this is more for your collision, your restoration. Let's say, remember on the hood over here, we used just our glazing putty because we had some chips and whatnot, but over here for this actual body filler, it's gonna be a little bit more useful for more body damage. So that's the difference between a body filler just like this and something just like this. You can see even in the directions, it's used to fill pinholes, sand surfaces, imperfections, different things like that. You know, you can still use it over a large area, but don't expect it to get your panel nice and flat. It's just for pretty much last minute things, or even if you had a dent that wasn't really that bad and you worked the metal, you could use a little bit of glaze. But I always recommend that if you're doing some decent body work, go ahead with a premium body filler first. That's gonna help you out, and you can always finish up with the glazing putty. Now, before we end things here, let's go ahead and take the top off, and we can see all of the sanding dust has accumulated here, and basically it's done its job. So this dust isn't anywhere in the garage, it's basically contained, and that's exactly what the system is supposed to do. So really happy about that. Well, I gotta say, it really worked out well with the DSB sanding system. I could tell it was really working because if you take a look at the ground over here, there's absolutely no dust to talk about, and that makes me really happy. Now, as far as sanding goes, that's a really good, easy way to get your surface sanded. If you take a look and you just feel, I like to feel with a glove because basically that helps me just smooth over the whole entire surface. And just by feeling it, I know that this basically is ready for its primer job. So if you use the tips and tricks in the video today, from going ahead and mixing to applying to sanding, you're gonna get awesome results like this. Now, how would you follow this up? You could do 2 or 3 coats of high build primer and then sand that down with a 400 to 600 grit, and you're good for paint. Well, guys, this is Brian from Paint Society reminding you, don't overthink it. It's just paint. I'll see you guys on the next episode.